don't work as well in person. That's why most...
Hi there. Welcome to another exciting edition of Cambridge Inside Out. My name is Robert Wieners, and my usual co-host, Susanna Sagat, isn't with us this week because she's out of town. But I've decided to bring another former school committee member, a much more recent former school committee member, Marc McGovern, to join us this week as both guest and guest co-host. So
very happy to be here, sir.
Well, good to have you, Marc. Now that you've had both the experience of a mayoral election now under your belt, as well as your first official regular meeting of the City Council, which was, I guess, last night. A rather brief meeting.
It was. It was. Usually on school committee, that public comment wouldn't even be over by then. So it was,
I was actually joking with some of the usual peanut gallery about that, and saying like, well, you know, it's because they had a really short agenda. I said, what, you think there's some correlation between the size of the agenda and the length of the meeting?
Are you insinuating that we like to talk a little bit?
Well, sometimes, yeah, but also the public comment might just go on and on and on and on, you know, and that's not, you can look at there might be one agenda item that might bring 3 hours of public testimony.
That's right. No, that's true.
You know, and that's part of what we expect in here. So anyway, one of the I'm going to make my confession here, which is yes, please, everyone.
Which one?
You know, it's as a kid who was born and raised in New York City, grew up in New York City, and lived the first 23 years of my life. Even though I've lived most of my life in Cambridge, I've often made the joke, I'll never be a true Canterbridgian. So I'm going to just confess to you and to the world that this is my one great envy in life. Is that I've always felt somewhat envious of those who have them.
I'm happy to do your show anyway.
Well, I think, you know, I was actually, when I was walking over here today, I was kind of thinking back about, it's actually an experience back when I was, in the days when even I was a candidate. This was actually around 1995. I was actually walking back after a candidate forum with Donnie Harding. Mm-hmm. And we got to talking about the distinction between, you know, being somebody who was born and raised here and somebody who sort of got engaged in civic and political affairs, but who didn't have, you know, it was a very different experience. And I actually remember walking down the street, I think it was Windsor Street or something, and saying, you know, I look at these buildings here and I think in terms of floor area ratios and zoning and whatever, all the things that the civic activists think of, and you probably have a totally different perspective. And then he just started telling about all the experiences he's had growing up and how, you know, a friend of his had some bad experience in that building over there and whatever. It's just a radically different perspective. And I would argue certainly that to be an elected official, it's a distinct advantage to actually, you know, have the city sort of in your bones, in your veins.
Well, you know, it's interesting because it tends to come up, you know, a lot, and I certainly am not shy about sharing, you know, my my history here and my family's history here because I'm proud of it.
Actually, multiple generations.
Multiple. My kids are. Well, my grandmother just told me this. I've been saying my kids are the fifth to live in Cambridge, but actually my great-great-grandfather actually lived here too, so that would technically make them the sixth. But we'll stick with five. But
they came over on the McMayflower.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, it's not just about. I mean, it's not just about being born and raised here. To me, what's important is that if you live here and you're able to stay here, and that's a whole other discussion I'm sure we'll get into, that you're involved in the community. There are a lot of people who, you know, didn't grow up in Cambridge, but came to Cambridge 30 years ago, 40 years ago, who really engaged in the community and have worked in the community, have been involved in politics and committees, and really made this community their home. And that, I mean, I haven't, you know, that's to me is great.
It makes me feel like your adopted little brother.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But, you know, I mean, it does, what I've often said is that, you know, when I think of whether I'm on the school committee or the city council, you know, when I make decisions about what I'm going to vote for or not vote for, I'm not just thinking about the here and now. I'm thinking about how is this going to impact my kids and my grandkids and other people's grandkids. And it is a, you know, it's when you're from a place, there's an ownership to it that I think you don't have if you're not from here, but that's true anywhere. It doesn't. Cambridge isn't unique in that. It's if you grew up and if you were still living in New York and I moved there, which I never would because I hate the Yankees. You would, you know, you would have that same feel, you know. So it's not unique to Cambridge. It's just, you know, it's just
I've
the way
done
it is.
everything to be part of this community. I came here as a Yankees fan. Actually, not just a Yankees fan, a diehard Yankee fan. And then after a while, it was very helpful to have George Steinbrenner be such an evil guy.
Mhm.
Eventually, I said, you know, I've always sort of liked the Red Sox, and now I'm like diehard Red Sox.
Oh,
fan.
that's good. Well,
My
that's
old
the
New York
first step.
friends, they do not understand.
That's the
this.
first step. You admitted you had a problem, and then you took some steps to,
That's right,
to
you know.
correct it. So that's good. Yeah, but it's no. You have done. I mean, the service that you've provided to the people of this city, I think, is tremendous, and it's you know, we don't always agree on the issues, but nobody always agrees on the issues.
You can't be right all the time, Mark.
Well,
No.
it's most of the time, but you'll come around eventually. But you know, the service you provide with your website and the analysis that you do, whether I agree with your position or I don't. I mean, that's a great. I mean, so many people say, "Oh, did you go to the Cambridge Civic Journal and did you look at, especially around election time?" And
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great service that you do on your own. You're not, you know, maybe we have the poet populace. Maybe we need the political pundit populace, and we can.
No. There'll always be accusations that, oh yeah, well, no, you know, you only did it because you were with so and so
Yeah,
and whatever.
yeah,
But
well-
once you get into the sort of the political side of things, it's you know,
Yeah.
nobody will ever think. I mean, what I do certainly as a public service primarily. I mean, it's kind of, we say it's sort of like when you run a newspaper. You run a newspaper, you have to, you put out 40 pages of paper. That gives you the right to have 2 pages of editorial comment. I try to stay close to that ratio. Sometimes you go a little over the top, but, you know,
Well-
it's primarily a public service, though.
But these are, you know, these are important and emotional issues that we toss around. I mean, some of them. I mean, some of them are, you know, some of the stuff is, I think some of the stuff the school committee has done and that the council has done and will do are pretty straightforward, and they're not, you know, they're not terribly controversial. But then there are some that are controversial, and people feel very passionately about them. It affects people's lives, and it leads to at times some pretty heated debate, which I don't have a problem with. I think where it gets fuzzy is when you know, that gets carried over, right? And I think we've seen that in the past where, you know, I don't have to like you personally to like an order that you filed and to
Right.
support an order. And I think people talked a lot during the campaign about the dysfunction of the former city council. The dysfunction wasn't that they argued sometimes. I mean, that's not great, but that happens sometimes.
Yeah.
It's just that they couldn't let it go when they moved on to the next issue. And that to me has always been something I've always tried to do. You and I could go toe to toe, and then the next issue we're side by side. And I
Right.
think that's,
Well, and hopefully, you know, maybe the city will be all side by side and everything. I doubt it, but, you know, maybe a little closer the next few years. I've always had this perspective that, you know, people don't put enough attention to the word representative. When you're a city council, you are a representative. You're a school committee member, you are a representative of the public. Well, the public is occasionally divisive. The public is occasionally ready to beat each other up a bit too. So, you know, to me, it's totally appropriate that occasionally that you have a little bit of friction amongst elected officials. You know, it's nicer. I mean, to me, if there's nothing but peace and harmony, then it means the city is having nothing but peace and harmony. So it's a pretty good goal.
Yeah, it is.
But
It
just
is.
a goal.
It is. But, you know, I'm also a pretty realistic person, and certainly something we should all strive for. But it doesn't, just because two people may debate, doesn't mean that it's dysfunction. And I think sometimes, you know, there have been and again, I keep referring to school committee because I've only been on the council for 2 meetings. You know, sometimes what comes out of that spirited debate is a better policy, is a better order, is something that's actually better for the community than, because of that discussion, than if everyone just kind of unanimously approves everything that everybody does. You know, you actually can get to a better place and you just can't take that stuff personally, and you can't carry it over and refuse to work with somebody because they disagreed with you on a particular issue.
I think that kind of brings back my point about being a representative. The thing is, there are things upon which I know Central Square, Kendall Square, and citywide, Lord knows, anybody who lives through the rent control years knows this too. there are things that are really substantial differences amongst people. We elect representatives to go out and they can fight it out so we don't have to. So in a way, you know, if the elected officials are having a spirited debate or maybe something even more so, you know, that in a way is doing a service for us.
Right.
You know, you guys can carry that out and come to some sort of reasonable agreement and consensus, and then you've done us all a good service. So
Yeah, well, I try. I mean, I'm certainly not perfect, but I have my moments, as you know. But it's something I try to do anyway.
all right. So Mark, I just want to talk a little bit more just about first. You know, we can get into the governance. I was going to kick
I know
off-
we're doing this sort of backwards than how you planned.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I sort of like the fact that your name is McGovern, and we'll talk about government. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, you were sort of destined for the role, I guess.
Well,
Right?
I guess.
Right. But, you know, you were a guy who was born and raised here, and, you know, you have a perspective of, you know, when on a school committee, you can actually say, well, I actually went to the Cambridge Public Schools, right? When people talk about the high school, you can say, I remember when I was in high school. You can talk about the people you know going through there. So I'm just going to sort of fling it to you here,
Okay.
to some degree, and just to say, you know, tell us about growing up in Cambridge and you know, coming through the schools, and not just the schools, but, you know, hanging out with your buddies. Were you a Harvard Square denizen, a Central Square denizen, or did you not get out of the house much?
I was a denizen of the entire city. But
Of course.
no,
How could
I
I be mistaken?
spent a lot of time in the pit
Ah,
in high school. I had spikes up to here. Hair was shaved on the
you
sides.
got to bring that up to the Sullivan chamber.
Yeah, well, it's funny. My stepmother posted on Facebook a picture of my getting sworn in, and then my high school graduation picture.
Oh yeah.
And I'm getting my diploma from Walter Sullivan.
Yep.
And I'm sitting there with Wayfarer sunglasses on and a cigar, and so I texted it to Michael, and I said, you know, yeah, this is this is me and your dad. You know, there were some of those moments, but I definitely I hung out in Harvard Square a lot. I grew up in Central Square, so this was my home. But
I always think of Remington Street. The building on Remington Street is where did you grow up there, or Pleasant Street?
Well, we
or
had,
where would you?
you know, and I talked about this during the campaign. I am so lucky. I could not afford to live in Cambridge today if my great-grandfather didn't purchase the property that he did.
Right.
There's no question of that. And I remind myself of that every day. I remind my children of that every day. It is part of the reason that I do what I do as a social worker and in politics, because I didn't earn that.
Right.
You know, and so he has the house on Pleasant Street in Central Square,
Right.
and it's a couple different apartments. My grandmother lives on the 3rd floor. I live on the 2nd floor.
That would be the house with the McGoverns.
There's a few McGovern signs out, and that it's on a corner. It's great. It's great signage. And then my great aunt, my grandmother's sister lives there, and a cousin lives there. And then we have the 2 houses on Remington and Harvard, which actually we just sold, sadly.
Ooh.
And yeah, I mean, it'd been. My great grandfather had 12 kids, and as they have slowly passed on, that property has just gotten divided between a million different cousins, most of whom have never lived in Cambridge, don't care about I want to sell it and get my money. So it was really for those of us, and I did live there. My first apartment with my first wife was my parents' first apartment when they got married.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
And so to see that now, I drive by it now, and I'm like, it's not,
That's hard.
it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah.
It was really sad. But you know, it's but I lived there, sort of off and on.
Yeah.
You know, for a little while with my mother and brothers when I was a kid, and then back there with my wife and kids, and so. But really, the house on Pleasant Street is kind of that's the homestead. That's the one that I primarily always come back to.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah, and actually that's a kind of a nice thing just to sort of know that you've got these sort of familiar roosts that you were, you know, as the years go by, you can always still look at that. Hopefully the houses will remain. We'll see what goes. Now, actually, how many years has it been since, you know, in a way, because now I'm becoming the old fogey here. and I still think of, oh yeah, McGovern, he recently out of high school, but that's got to be a long time ago
87.
now.
87, yeah.
All righty.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. And
yeah.
you were actually part of, you had some classmates who sort of gone on to, magnificence.
Yes, well, a lot that have gone on to magnificence, some more public magnificence than others. I was actually older, but very good friends with, and part of my, my little group with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck and Marjorie Decker.
And as I threatened to point out, you had a cameo appearance in Good Will Hunting.
It was a stretch. I had to play a Harvard student, so for a townie, that was that was tough. That was I had to dig in deep to that.
Was
that role.
Was that the scene that was supposedly in the old
Bow and Arrow? Yeah.
Which I actually go back for. I always think of as Father's Six.
Oh,
right.
Okay. Yeah.
Back where you could go there for a buck and a half for a pitcher of Knickerbocker, and on the weekends you could make your own hot dogs for a dime.
It was the
now
original plan.
Like
I know you do. The original plan was, because when we would go to the Bow, they had that little basketball game with the little mini basketballs.
Yeah.
So I was pretty good at that. It was perfect size. And so Matt and Ben, the plan was to have me playing that game in that scene.
Yeah.
But it was sort of in the back, and so we went up. We actually filmed the inside part in Toronto.
Right.
And so we drove up there and met with them the night before, and we're hanging out with the director, and he said, oh, you can't be in the back. And so he pulled some poor kid that probably thought like, this is going to be my moment, and he bumped him over to the scene where you couldn't actually see him and plugged me in his place. And actually Matt didn't even know. So in the first cut, he was talking, and then he looked and he was like, what are you doing? And they had to cut. So, it was no thanks to them that I got that scene. It was actually the director that gave it to me.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting. Both of those guys do still periodically come back and express interest in things locally. There was some rallies and things. I remember Ben Affleck especially speaking about some of the, I think it was service workers at Harvard University, because he has family roots who actually were involved in exactly working in that job.
Yeah. But both of those guys have gone on and to do things on sort of the world stage. Right. But it's funny because it's not, those are the two easy guys to point to. But there are so many. Everybody thinks they grew up in the heyday of wherever they grew up or whatever it was, right?
Well, I know I did.
Right, I'm sure you did. But there are so many of the people that I went to school with who are teachers and social workers and other things that don't make the $20 million paychecks or get the Academy Awards, but as equally, actually probably more important in the scheme of things, and that I think we should be equally as proud of and celebrate. And so it was a good group. It was a good group that year, or those years.
I think the people who I know from my high school days who've gone on to fame and fortune were people who played in rock and roll bands.
Really?
Yeah, with the Dictators, which is an early new wavy band, and a group called the Fleshtones.
The Fleshtones, I know.
You know them?
I've heard the Fleshtones before.
Well, when they come and play here, they stay at my house.
Oh, really?
We're buddies and pals from way back when.
And that wasn't your thing?
I thought about it a bit, but I don't know that a rock and roll band really needed an accordion player. But then again, there's been some pretty good ones.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We could have gone for that. I still have my accordion from those days.
I actually have a friend who plays the accordion, and she also plays guitar and other things, but she's in a band and she plays the accordion, and I think they do pretty well around town. Yeah. So you never know. Never close that door, Robert.
No,
if this gig doesn't work out for you,
I can always go back to rock and roll.
That's right. That's right. Or you can just stand out in front of the Dunkin' Donuts with your accordion and do that.
Yeah, actually, I remember this was a guy. This is a little sort of story from New York. Growing up, I went to Flushing High School. There was an old black man who used to sit in front of I think the Gertz department store on Roosevelt Avenue in Flushing, and he sat there. He had a tin cup. He was a blind man, and he played accordion. He was really quite good, but he was very thankful, and he would just collect change. One of the most amazing moments I ever had was I had a friend Alan who had been. He learned to play blues guitar with Reverend Gary Davis. He was actually Reverend Davis's last student before Reverend Davis passed away. And Reverend Davis's wife, Annie, would hold these gospel services. They sort of rotated people in the congregation. So Alan would get invited. So we actually went up to South Bronx to a blues gospel service. It was something. I mean, we were the only two white guys in the place. But somehow, we had this sort of protection around us. We could be going through a hard neighborhood. We said nobody was going to touch us. We were great. And at this thing, this guy, who was just this fixture in Flushing, he shows up and he takes, it was amazing. He takes this like bucket of change and he just sort of puts it in the collection plate at the service. This was the money he was collecting at the Allen Roosevelt Avenue.
Wow, that's cool.
And then he played his heart out, and he wasn't just like the guy on the street.
Right.
There he was. He was playing with blues players who were just magnificent.
Yeah.
It's like,
Oh, great.
when you pass somebody on the street
right.
and they're doing something,
Absolutely.
you never know.
You never
You
know.
may be passing somebody who's a really a jewel
Yeah.
of a person.
Yeah.
So
That's cool. It's a cool story.
yeah. So now, all right. So just sort of say. One perspective is you as a kid growing up, but now it's rather
I got
different.
kids growing up.
Now you've got kids growing up, right? You've got, 4 children?
Four.
Four
17, or soon to be 17.
Yeah,
Who is a junior at the high school, Nick.
yeah. So he's your spy to kind of keep dibs on things?
My Nick and my 13-year-old son, Will, who's 7th grade at Cambridge Street, hate all that, because I have so many eyes out there. These two cannot, by the time they get home, it's so, this is what I heard today. And because everyone, they get, it's tough on them sometimes.
They're ID'd. Yeah,
They're ID'd. And then I
ID'd.
have 3-year-old twins.
3-year-old twins, yeah, the cutest kids on earth.
They're pretty
Absolutely.
cute, thank you.
Yeah. No, it's one of the, we were also Facebook friends.
Yes.
And one of the nice things about that is you actually get to sort of see the photos.
Yeah. Well, I think, hi Connor and Addison. I think they're watching to see, Dad on TV.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the older kids don't care anymore. They're like, we've watched enough school committee meetings. Like they don't, but the younger ones still get excited.
So you're, the way I look at it, this puts you invested more than anyone can imagine. I think in terms of the future of the city, when you have not only roots going back multiple generations, but also your own children growing up in a city like this.
Yeah.
So, if there's a discussion about Central Square or Harvard Square or, tax base or, middle income earners, whatever, it's sort of nice to be able to, have that level of ownership.
Yeah. It's weird, honestly, because there's this part that, when I said before about you're thinking about, I'm thinking about my kids and my grandkids, and I don't mean that so much specifically about them, because one of the things I've always tried to do is not think about my kids on the school committee when I make decisions. I've taken many votes that are not in the best interest of my own children.
Right.
And so I'm not there. A lot of people, they run for school committee because they've had a bad experience with the schools and they want to get in there to fix it for their kid. And that's in other communities. Here I think it's a little different because politics is different in Cambridge.
Yeah.
But my kids, the Cambridge Public Schools have always done well by kids like mine. It's not about them. So, now in the council, yes, it's more about, I mean that more symbolically of thinking of the future. And I know that because I'm lucky and because we have this house and assuming that I'm going to get to stay in that till the end, I have to walk down these streets and see the people that long after I'm an elected official and see what I voted and, oh my goodness, look at that huge building that I voted for or against, or so that accountability is it's a real personal one too, because I'm gonna be in this community hopefully for the rest of my life, and so you're sort of balancing that just those personal things along with sort of that bigger commitment that you have to the people who live here and will live here.
Right. Well, I'll just sort of, now that the election is over, I'll just sort of say I think the voters of Cambridge did good by by putting you in office.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, and this wasn't some sort of a spur of the moment thing. If I'm might put you on the spot briefly here, I think you actually pulled papers for a city council seat way back, even before school committee.
No.
No?
Never.
Really?
Never.
All right, well, then
Nope.
maybe you signed your name onto the sheet, the wrong sheet or something. That's,
Oh, no, nope,
not at all?
never did. No, it was school committee first. My father ran for city council in '63,
Is
but,
that right?
yeah.
Okay, well, I wasn't there
And
for
he was,
that.
it was funny, because I referenced him a little bit during the campaign,
Yeah.
because he was, this working class, came from a working class family in Cambridge, the first in his family to go to college, got to go to Harvard on a full scholarship.
Yeah.
And he was about 20, I think, when he ran. And his whole campaign was based on A Tale of Two Cities. And it was, back then, it was this local Cambridge kid from a working class family that had been here. Now he's on the other side of Cambridge's tracks.
Mhm.
And how can he bring, and he came in 10th.
Right.
He did all right.
Yeah.
Back when you needed, far more votes to get elected.
That's right.
But in some ways, the city, we're still a tale of two cities in a lot of ways. And it may not be university, may not be as much town gown as much as it is sort of this new face of Cambridge.
In a way, it's more of a tale of three or more cities now. I mean, you still have the universities and sort of the academic West Cambridge sort of crowd, but and you have a lot of sort of townies who are working class roots, smaller fraction of the city, I think, than before. But you now have the sort of the emerging part of the city as well, the kind of people who will work in those Kendall Square jobs. And they're kind of expressing themselves. I think in many ways, even the election results were in many ways a reflection of the sort of that evolving.
Yeah.
It's no longer a dichotomy. It's,
Right.
these
I
three.
think you're, that's true. And that's good. That's not a bad thing. It's great to live in a city that evolves and changes. Otherwise, you're in a city that, because that's what cities do, hopefully. And otherwise, you're in a city that's stagnant. And you look at some cities that, they lose their industry and they never replace it. And then those cities fall apart. And,
Well,
that's what makes Cambridge dynamic.
and we'll come back to some of those points in a moment. But for now, I was going to bow out and take 3 minutes off, and we'll be back in a few minutes with
All right.
Cambridge Inside Out.